For many of us, fall means getting back into our usual routines. Back to school or work, or, like us, back to making weekly podcast episodes. Welcome to our new season, by the way. And one big thing on our minds as Canadians as we get back to reality is the economy.
It is front and center in everything, in politics and news, at the dinner table.
That's Scotiabank senior economist Farah Omran. And along with all this talk about the economy come numbers, stats, indicators, as economists like Farah call them, and lots of them.
And it can be very difficult to understand or know what actually matters and what it means for us. But these indicators are not just abstract numbers. They are signals that can really inform us on how the economy is doing and what we can expect.
So Farah's here this episode to break down 5 key economic indicators. She'll give Natalie Nanowski from the Perspectives newsroom a crash course on a handful of numbers to keep an eye on to help you better understand the state of the economy. Things like GDP growth, the Bank of Canada policy rate, unemployment. She'll not only tell us what these numbers really mean, but also what their limitations are and what else to look at in order to get a full sense of where the economy is headed. So next time you read a headline, you'll be equipped to better understand what's really going on.
Because when we are thinking about the health of the economy and how it relates to us, we really need to look beyond the headline numbers and look at the details.
I'm Stephen Maurice, and welcome to a new season of Perspectives. Now here's Natalie Nanowski.
Hi, Farah. Welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So you're here today with 5 key indicators to help Canadians read the state of the economy. And as we heard in the intro, that's really top of mind right now.
Absolutely. So really understanding them and knowing what to look for can help us make use of these indicators and better understand how they will affect us, and particularly help us engage with how they are reported in the media. Because often there could be 2 different articles or analyses about the same economic indicator that can communicate very different messages.
Okay, let's get right into the first indicator that can help us understand the state of the economy. That's inflation. Now, this is an economic term that I'm sure most Canadians are familiar with. It was a thing that everyone was kind of talking about during the pandemic. Let's go back to basics, though. What is inflation?
Inflation is basically the rate of price increases. And it matters because it really says something about our cost of living and our standards of living, which is, at the end of the day, what really matters for all of us. So when inflation increases, it basically erodes our purchasing power. We can now afford less with the same amount of money if it's not met with an increase in income. And that's what we are talking about when we talk about real wages falling. At a minimum, you want your real wages to stay stable over time. And as you said, this became top of mind after COVID when inflation shot up above the Bank of Canada target. And it was really stubborn to bring down. And it kind of created these spillover effects on many other parts of our lives, from higher interest rates, more expensive mortgages, to a slower labor market and lower housing prices.
Mm-hmm. So what is the normal rate when it comes to inflation? Where should it be?
So the Bank of Canada target range for inflation is between 1% and 3%, with 2% being the midpoint. And that is the sweet spot. It is a low and stable rate of price increases, and we all know it and know what to expect when we're planning for the future, including companies planning the increase in prices of the goods that they sell, because they also know what to expect for the prices of inputs and the wages that they need to pay their employees.
Mm-hmm. So the range is between 1% and 3%. Is it dangerous if it goes to the lower side of 1%, and why?
So too low inflation can signal deflation or economic stagnation, and too high inflation above the Bank of Canada target range erodes our wages and strains our household budgets.
Mm-hmm. It seems like inflation is probably the most reported number in the news. Is there anything we should be careful of when we're looking at that number in the headlines?
So first, I would say that the headline number, the year-over-year inflation, which is mostly what is quoted in the headlines, that's not very useful as a measure to the extent that it is backward looking and it's sensitive to base effects. So let's say last year, same month, the price index was too low or too high. It impacts what it shows up as a year-over-year rate today. I would suggest looking at the month-over-month annualized measure for a better sense of what is currently happening and how it's changing over time. Also to look at core measures that remove the most volatile items like energy and food. It gives us a better picture of underlying inflationary pressure and trends in the economy. I would also look at what is driving the inflation increase? Is it broad-based or is it just a couple of items? Is it something temporary, like from a strike or weather event, or is it something more persistent that might propagate into future inflation? And lastly, I would say that we need to be very mindful of headlines, particularly around inflation, because they really can be misleading. They can either communicate it as a good thing or a bad thing, based on the messaging. So let's say in a specific month, we had the inflation be 2.7% year over year. One headline can read that inflation slowed in June to 2.7%, which is accurate. Another headline can read inflation was above economists' expectations at 2.7%, which is also accurate, but both are focusing on a different message.
Okay, let's now jump into our second indicator. This is GDP growth. So very quickly, what is GDP growth?
So GDP, the gross domestic product, is the total value of goods and services that we produce in our economy. So it basically gives us an overall understanding of the economy's performance, whether it's expanding or contracting and by how much. Basically, it's the economy's report card that tells us about business investment, consumer demand, and overall living standard over time.
And so what is a good number for GDP?
Typically, we would benchmark and compare GDP growth against what we call potential growth, which is the maximum rate at which the economy can grow without fueling inflation. So it's the economy using up all of the productive capacity, but at a sustainable level without overheating. For Canada, this is estimated to be around 2%. The economy can grow below that in a slowdown, and above that, let's say, if it's actually recovering from an earlier slowdown. Needless to say that negative growth rates or too low growth rates are not good, particularly if we have consecutive negative growth rates that are broad-based, we would be in a recession. And too high economic growth potential is also not good. So if our economy is growing very strong and that's not matched with an increase in potential growth rate, then we're looking at overheating and inflationary pressures like the episodes we've seen recently. I should also add that when I say the potential growth rate for Canada is currently estimated around 2%, lately forecasts for this have been lowered because of the trade tensions that we're experiencing. So this rate is expected to be slightly weaker in the next few years.
Why is it a bad thing if the GDP numbers are high if there is so much growth? Isn't that like an economic boom?
Yes, that only is bad if it's not matched with an increase in productive capacity. Because if we're growing too much relative to our constraint, the economy's real constraint to produce and consume, then we're hitting up against the wall. And that's when we begin a period where during COVID, the COVID recovery, where the boom was really fueled by consumption, and that consumption surpassed our ability to produce. And then we saw these large wage and inflation increases that spiraled and led to the monetary policy tightening cycle that we've been in.
Mm-hmm. Part of this exercise is for people to understand the shortcomings of some of these measures. What can people keep in mind when thinking about the GDP numbers?
So just like inflation, I would look beyond the headlines when we're looking at the GDP numbers as well. The mostly reported on GDP number is a quarterly frequency based on the national accounts, and that includes the effects of trade and business inventories, which are not really related to the economy's health domestically. So we can look at domestic demand. That's a measure that nets out the impact of these effects and is more telling about the health of the domestic economy. We can also look at the GDP per capita. If the economy over the long term, and that is key, over the long term, persistently growing less than its population, then we are not keeping up. We're not all doing better. And very importantly, we need to look at who is benefiting from economic growth. If the economy is growing, but that is concentrated in a small segment of the population, that's also not necessarily a good thing. And that's where income inequality indicators become relevant.
All right. So indicator number 2 is GDP growth. The next indicator is one we hear reported a lot in the news, the unemployment rate. It seems like a bellwether for general economic distress. How should people read the unemployment numbers when they see them?
So the unemployment rate and other labor market announcements are, as you said, very prevalent in the news. We get them every month, and there's a lot of focus on them. And it feels like the closest way that we interact with the economy because it impacts our own sense of job security and financial security. Strong labor market and a low unemployment rate signals strong economy, wage increases, and stability and security, and a sharp increase in the unemployment rate signals the opposite. So in terms of looking at them, for Canada, the long-run equilibrium unemployment rate is estimated to be around 6% nowadays. At any point of time, it is normal to have some unemployment in the economy because people are between jobs, people are looking for jobs. And also, it is the rate that is considered to be non-inflationary. And that's what we call the NIRU, the non-accelerating inflationary rate of unemployment. At that level of unemployment, the economy is neither overheating or is too slow. For Canada specifically, with that rough estimate of 6%, let's say anything below 5% might signal overheating in the economy, a situation where you see wages increase unsustainably and fueling inflation, and monetary policy needs to step in to slow it down. And an unemployment rate above, let's say, 7% would signal trouble in the opposite direction.
Mm-hmm. And that estimated unemployment rate that kind of is unique to each and every country, is that based on demographics like age and the working population?
Absolutely. It's based on each country's structural factors, including the ones that you just mentioned.
So when people read the unemployment numbers, what should they be taking into account to kind of get a fuller picture of what's going on?
First, I think we should look at the drivers of the unemployment rate release. Is the unemployment rate increasing because we are losing jobs or because more people are joining the labor force? We should also look at job quality. Is the unemployment rate falling because we are adding full-time permanent jobs, or is it just part-time temporary jobs? In this case, it might mean that more people are working, but they're not necessarily making more money or feeling more secure. We also should look at who is affected. Is there a specific age segment or sector that is experiencing more losses than others? I would also say that we can look at other indicators to help round up just the general assessment of the labor market, like the participation rate, wage trends, job vacancies and shortages. All of these are important indicators to look at when we're looking at the unemployment and the labor market.
Okay. Our fourth indicator, this is a big one. This is the Bank of Canada policy rate. We have announcements about this every, I think, 6 weeks or so. So remind me and everyone else, what is the Bank of Canada policy rate?
So the Bank of Canada policy rate is the blunt tool that it uses to influence borrowing rates. This includes mortgage rates, car loans, business loans. So it really is this blunt tool that impacts the whole economy. So just like there is a long-run equilibrium level for the unemployment rate and a long-run equilibrium level for the growth rate of the economy, there is also an equilibrium policy rate that we call the neutral rate. When the policy rate is at neutral, it's neither stimulating nor slowing the economy. For Canada, this is estimated right now to be around 2.5 to 3%. Going below that would be considered easy monetary policy, where you're stimulating the economy and spending and borrowing and increasing inflation. And going much above that, you're being restrictive and tight, and you are slowing the economy.
So in general, if people see the rate go up or if they see the rate go down, what should they take from all of that?
So they need to take it as part of a bigger economic context. So as we just said, one thing to look at first is what is neutral. So for example, during the COVID pandemic and leading up to the COVID pandemic, we actually had the policy rate be too low, right? They were significantly below their neutral level. And then as the central banks all over the world started hiking, a lot of people were waiting for the policy rate to go down where they were before the pandemic. And that was never the plan, right? The plan is always to try to land at neutral. What's also very important is to actually look at the real rate, not just the nominal rate. So the one that we hear about in the news when we see that the bank cut to 275 or 250, that's the nominal rate. The real rate is the nominal rate minus the inflation rate, and that's what actually matters for the economy. Take an example where the Bank of Canada might not do anything with the policy rate. The nominal rate is unchanged, but inflation is falling. That means that then the real rate is higher. It is more restrictive. And that is what actually tells us how loose or tight monetary policy is. We can also focus on the bank's forward guidance when they make these announcements. These are very indicative of how the bank is thinking about the economy, and even the most subtle of changes in the communications around the announcement can indicate a shift in thinking. And also, importantly, market expectations leading up to the announcement and after the announcement. Sometimes the announcement itself is actually less important than whether it surprised or matched the market expectations.
Before we go into the next indicator, I just want to go back to something you said. You said pre-pandemic, the interest rate levels were too low. Why is an interest rate of just, 1.69 or something problematic?
So again, this all goes back to the neutral rate that is estimated for the economy. This is based on many structural factors of the economy, and it's consistent with an economy actually growing at its potential, with the unemployment rate being at its long-term equilibrium. When they're much below that, as we said, that will stimulate the economy beyond its productive capacity. That's one thing. Then you can, have an economy that is overheating. Inflation is shooting way above target, which is not good for people. It's not good for people to have prices spiral out of control. The interest rate is effectively used to control inflation and keep it at target and make sure that the economy is not overheating and it's not too slow. One other thing is, if you're too low and you're close to the zero lower bound, which, it exists, then you don't have any room to support the economy at times of a shock like COVID. Had we been at neutral entering COVID, we might have had more easing room. Not that we necessarily needed it, but that's just an example.
Okay. So our fifth indicator is a big one, and it's something people talk about all the time. It's housing prices. What stats exactly are the big ones that we should be looking out for when it comes to housing prices?
So housing prices are big, as you say, because they're not just about real estate, right? They're about wealth. They're about affordability. They're about equality, generational mobility, homelessness. So it is really a key social issue while being a key driver of economic growth. And needless to say, the situation in Canada has not been great. We are and have been in a housing crisis with a lot of shortages and lack of affordability, which is driven by many factors that we won't get into today, since we're focusing on how to actually just read the indicator in the news. In terms of what would be a good house price growth, generally you would want house prices to keep up with incomes to maintain affordability. Too big of a spike or too big of a crash, they both equally destabilize the economy and harm Canadians, given how important this is as a part of our economy. In looking at house prices, maybe one thing that you can focus on is instead of the average sales price, one can focus on the benchmark indices. Those typically abstract from the composition of sale. They're not as sensitive to what is, driving the sales. Is it more expensive, luxurious homes or cheaper condos? So that might be a better reference point as to how the house prices are changing. But I would say with the housing market, what is most important in a market like this that is truly emotional at its core is to zoom out from month over month short-term changes that the media really focuses on and really just look at long-term trends to get a better sense of what's going on in the market compared to its long-term averages and how sales and prices are changing over time. A very good example is that during COVID, when we had prices declining after the bank started increasing its rate, and prices were becoming much lower than the peak during the pandemic, but effectively they were always still quite above where they were before the pandemic even started. And lastly, we can also look at things like the sales to new listings ratio, for example, to get a sense of how tight the market is. Maybe home vacancies or unsold inventories, those can help complete the picture.
Okay. So that wraps up our big 5 indicators, but you came in with a bonus one. We have a 6th one, and it is productivity. Tell us about that.
Well, I want to start by saying that I left this one until the end, not because it is the least important, but because we might feel less connected to it because we do not have tangible, concrete ways of measuring it and understanding it. But it is actually arguably the most important of the ones we discussed today. Productivity is essentially the amount of units of output that we can produce per worker. And that concept has become more abstract over time as our economy shifted more towards services and outputs became more difficult to quantify. How do you quantify an hour of work in a service-based economy, including the hour we're spending here now? But productivity has very tangible implications, right? More productivity means that we can produce more with the same amount of resources, or we can produce the same amount for cheaper. This means more profits, more growth, and higher wages that don't fuel inflation. Why? That's because when we increase productivity, we increase the productive capacity of the economy, which is what we were talking about when we were discussing the potential growth rate and that acting as a speed limit for the economy, essentially. So if we increase the productive capacity of the economy, we can now grow more, have more wages without fueling inflation. And that really increases our living standards. Also, if we have more productivity, we are more competitive on the global stage. And I think that is particularly crucial today in the environment that we are in. It is one of the key tools in our toolkit to be more resilient.
So when you hear the productivity numbers reported, where should we be aiming for them to kind of sit?
So unlike the other indicators that we talked about, I don't actually think there is a level of productivity that is too much, at least given how bad we've been on this front for so long. So there's not a reasonable outcome on productivity in the near future that would take us to a too much level. We have a lot to catch up on, and we haven't been doing too well in this area. So really, whenever you hear in the news that productivity is increasing or business capital per worker is increasing, that only can be taken as a good thing from here. And that is especially true when we disconnect from the historical negative connotation of productivity as something that replaces workers and focus more on it as something that complements workers and help them sustain higher wages and a higher living standard. It's also very important to think of it as something that makes the revenue base for the government larger, which means that the government can actually serve us as citizens better. It can build more schools, more roads, more hospitals. All of those are really tangible in comparison to this abstract concept that is not, the implications are very tangible because that's what it can produce for us, which is very important in an environment where there's increasing pressure on our resources as our population ages.
So we've gone through these 5 plus a bonus one, 6 indicators. What's the takeaway here?
I think the takeaway is that everything is connected. And when we are thinking about the economy and the health of the economy and how it relates to us, we really need to look beyond the headline numbers and look at the details.
Farah, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
I've been speaking with Farah Omran, Senior Economist at Scotiabank. The Perspectives podcast is made by me, Natalie Nanowski, as well as Armina Lagaya, Stephen Maurice, and our producer, Andrew Norton. If you like this podcast, you may also like my show on YouTube Shorts called It's All Connected. Each episode breaks down an economic issue facing Canadians in an easy-to-understand way. You can find It's All Connected at youtube.com/Scotiabank.